context, how we are, in what context we're raised. Maybe your parents, your family, your friends have used language in certain ways. Maybe when you went to English classes yourselves, you had certain messages about using language. And so all of those messages influence what your language ideology is, your set of beliefs. And so these beliefs are constructed within specific spaces. And so these spaces can go from the micro level all the way to the macro level in terms of our culture, our political structures, all of those, bigger structures, how they influence what we believe about language, what languages are valued and which languages are not valued. And so I'm already seeing in the chat some ideas about this disruption, questioning this idea of how English should be taught, questioning the idea of English-only classrooms. Very good. So as you might see on the next slide, here are some examples of statements that represent specific language ideologies. So I want us to look at these statements and see if any of these, you've heard any of these statements before, maybe in English classes, maybe within your English teacher programs. So if you have seen this before, any of these statements, such as students should only speak English in the English classroom, or people who speak with accents are less proficient. Maybe you've heard that in certain terms in certain ways. Maintaining indigenous languages is less important than learning English. So if you've heard any of these statements, they represent specific ideologies. And it's important to note that while my presentation today doesn't, I'm not trying to, oh, there's my friend. Hi, Milton. I'm seeing my friends that are coming and joining us. Thank you so much. My colleague from the Autónoma. Yeah, we absolutely want to make sure that, we question what we believe. And we also consider that what we believe actually impacts our classroom practice and also ultimately impacts our students. And so we have to really question those beliefs as we are researchers and teachers. So I want to share a little bit about my own background in terms of my development of my language ideology. So you can see the really, really cute baby in the middle. You probably guessed that's me in the middle with my dad. And I grew up in Maine, which is a state that's really, really, it's the red state all the way to the very top near the border of Canada. And as you can imagine, my language that was learned, I was exposed to was only English. It was a very monolingual, monocultural environment. And so in this area, if I had only stayed there, probably I would have had some monolingual ideologies myself. But at some point when I was in high school, I had to take another language. In this case, my dad said, I think it would be best if you took Spanish. And that decision completely changed the trajectory of my life. My Spanish teacher, he thought, well, I'm going to just do like an immersive environment of only Spanish. And as you can imagine, that was a situation in which we were all confused. He did all the things that you're supposed to do. He did the gestures and the visuals and the dancing, but we were still confused. We didn't know anything. We didn't have that exposure in our environment, so it really wasn't meaningful to us. So then my Spanish professor began changing his way of thinking, his language ideology, and he started to incorporate more of our first language, in this case English, making connections, clear connections to grammatical structures in Spanish, to vocabulary in Spanish. And it was almost as if a light bulb went off, like, oh my goodness, I know that word in English. I know that what it means in Spanish now. So he was able to actually make connections to our background knowledge. And for the first time, I saw the power of cross-linguistic connections. Years later, I ended up going to college in Massachusetts, which is the state underneath a little bit right here in the, if you can see, it's like kind of looks like this. That state is where I did my undergraduate program and where I decided to become a teacher. I became a bilingual teacher and ended up moving to Texas, which if you look at the picture on the bottom left hand, That's a picture of myself and a student of mine. She happened to be dressed with the same outfit. She was my twin for that particular day. And I taught in Dallas, Texas as a bilingual elementary teacher for 20 years. And within this context, I learned something very powerful about translanguaging, bilingualism specifically. First, my students' first language was an important part of their identity, their linguistic and cultural identity. It was the first time that I was in a place where there were so many different languages and cultures, but obviously it's specifically due to the proximity to the border. All my students were had parents of Mexican descent. So their first language was Spanish, and they were in my bilingual classroom. And in this classroom environment, we specifically used their first language to help them understand and learn another language. And I saw that the strong students who were really, really strong in English were also really, really strong in Spanish. And that connection of how the languages are developed, it's not by accident. There's so much research. In fact, when I went and did my master's in bilingual education, I was exposed to all the research about bilingualism and how important it was for students to develop both languages, that they mutually benefited each other. Unfortunately, also within this context, I learned about systemic oppression, about how Spanish was devalued by the educational system. I had administrators who were monolingual administrators who said, no, they need to learn English, so only teach in English, only expose them to English, which goes against all the research and the principles of bilingualism and bilingual education. And so I became an advocate for my students' bilingualism in that context. And as a result, I did my doctorate in curriculum and instruction. And my main topic, of course, was about students' bilingualism, how it was developed and how it was influenced by the different sociocultural factors. So then 20 years later, after 20 years, I moved to Mexico. And I met my husband. Here he is on the bottom right. I think he's even joined our time together. So find a partner who's supportive of you. He's a non-researcher, but he supports my research, and I really appreciate that. But here we are as a family, my husband, my daughter, and myself. And in Mexico, I thought, I assumed, well, they'll be more open to Spanish in our English classrooms. That'll be that was my assumption when I came to Mexico. And so, interestingly, when I spoke to my students here at the Autónoma del Estado de Hidalgo, who are going to be future English teachers, they said, oh, Dr. Muñoz, we just keep getting these conflicting messages about how and when to use our students' first language. And, some professors tell me not to use it at all. Some, professors say, maybe only this with the beginner learners. And so how do we use it? What do we do? And so this idea of translanguaging became part of my research here in Mexico specifically, but ultimately it connects to my broader interests of equity and how it's important that we allow our students to have full access to their linguistic resources so that they can be part of the language process. So that's a little bit about me. And so when you think about translanguaging ideologies, here are some of the statements that you would consider that represent that belief that for me was constructed over both personal, professional, and then of course my educational studies. So you'll probably see things like, oh yes, students learn better when they can use all their linguistic resources, not just one, right? Translanguaging helps them express complex ideas. Bilingualism is an asset, right? It's an intellectual and social advantage. And then using their languages actually validates their identities. So if you contrast the previous slide of the monolingual ideologies and these are a lot more positive and more asset-based versus the ones that we saw in the previous slide. So really quickly, and I'm sure, hopefully you can see this on my screen well enough, but I want you to look at these two images. And if you probably heard of the term code switching before, so what would you say in the terms of these images, what is the main difference between what you can see? Go ahead and put that in the chat. What do you see as the main difference? I'll just give you a moment to do that. Okay, very good, Isaac. Yes, exactly, Dr. Rosa. Thank you. So yeah, when you see on the left-hand side, code switching, and that's kind of a term that when people were thinking about language and how bilingual individuals use language, they considered a bilingual person having separate spaces for their different linguistic systems, and they worked in isolation of each other. They really were more of an interference than anything else, and you probably will hear L1 interference in terms of this idea. Whereas translanguaging, and I love how Carla says this in the chat, absolutely, it treats the linguistic repertoire as a whole. And so it's considered, according to Garcia and Way, as a dynamic and integrated system. So most of us, I think all of us, are bilingual individuals. And the idea behind this is that when you go to a complex task and you're encountering a complex task that's a language task, you don't just say, okay, I'm only going to use my Spanish part of my brain, or I'm only going to use the English part. In fact, your brain is using all of those resources as tools to help you understand and construct meaning. And so that's the idea behind translanguaging. Now, pedagogical translanguaging is what as we as teachers can do to tap into our students' tools or their linguistic repertoire, as somebody mentioned in the text. And so when we think about it, you can see kind of some ideas in the bubble of what you can do as a teacher. Things like pre-writing discussions with your peer using all of your languages. Having that bilingual peer collaboration. Comparing grammatical structures across languages, using bilingual glossaries and translation tools, and then maybe even reading Spanish materials before you conduct English tasks. And these are just some ideas, but these are ways in which we can be strategic about using translanguaging in our English classrooms and language classrooms in general. So one of the things, and this is kind of a slide that displays some research about what are the findings with translanguaging. It's so interesting because I just came back from a conference, and of course my researcher friends were saying, okay, that's great, but what does the research say? Does this really work, right? And I love conferences because you get these great questions, and I was like, ooh, I need to include a slide that incorporates what research says. And so of course, when you think about all of these things such as increasing participation in the class, reducing language anxiety, improving reading comprehension, promoting inclusive learning environments, all of these things that you see on the slide, these things are beneficial for our language environment. Now, one thing that's important to note is that these studies, primarily in the field of translanguaging, typically are qualitative studies. So we do have a gap in terms of the methodologies, the methodology gap in terms of quantitative research. So that's something that we need to increase our contribution in terms of the field. But overall, these are some of the findings that we have as to date regarding translanguaging. And today I want to share with you a study that goes along with the same idea. In this case, I'm going to share with you something that I did in my academic writing class here at the university with my students who are pre-service English teachers, and how I use translanguaging in the classroom. And how this study was born was from my students who were saying, I just don't know how to use my students' first language in an English classroom. And so instead of just preaching at them, which is what we typically do, I wanted them to experience translanguaging themselves. And so that's what I did in this particular study. Along with my researcher friends here that you can see on the screen, Dr. Ilda from my department at the Autónoma de Hidalgo, as well as Dr. Kim Knowles from the University of Alberta, Canada. We designed this study with this lens in mind. What can we do to implement translanguaging in academic writing for our students? So before I get started about sharing the results, really quickly in the chat, this is another way for you to participate. I want you to tell me some things that make academic writing challenging. What are some things that you're like, ooh, especially in another language, not just in your first language, but I mean in another language, what makes academic writing specifically challenging in another language? So I'll give you some time to put some ideas. Thank you, Isaac. Different rhetorical patterns. Thank you. Okay, something that is different. Finding words and structures that are organized completely different from my native language. Absolutely. Vocabulary and syntax. That happens to be one of my students' biggest struggles when it comes to academic writing. They're like, oh, the vocabulary, it's different. It's quite different. When you read a research article, it's quite different from our normal conversation. You don't talk, about using those words with friends in English. Something else? Let's see, one more thing. Cohesion, absolutely. Having one central idea. When my husband, and he's in the chat tonight or in the group tonight, when he started off courting me, I guess you could say, we were boyfriend and girlfriend, and he wrote in Spanish to me, I noticed his writing was very cyclical. It just went on and on and on and on. I love you, I love you, I love you. And I was like, just get to the point. The way we write is very direct, and here's my point 1, 2, 3, 4. So absolutely, there's a different structure. Punctuation, register, absolutely. So this study, as I mentioned before, was to kind of address some of those challenges of academic writing using translanguaging as a tool to assist my students in writing in English. Specifically this course, the final product is a literature review. All of my students, they choose a topic that, as we had heard some presentations this evening about what they're going to be researching, our students choose a topic of what they would like to research. They read research articles, which is not their favorite thing to do, but they read research articles and then they start to write about what they've read, creating a literature review at the end. And so in this case, we decided, let's consider how we can use translanguaging to assist this process with our students. And so the theoretical framework for this particular study that I'm going to share with you obviously starts off with the translanguaging lens, but also we've included self-determination in terms of our theoretical framework. Why? Because our students said, I don't have any motivation to write academically. I don't feel like very autonomous in my writing. I feel a lack of competence, and the environment itself, I don't even feel like part of the academic environment for many different reasons. And so this kind of lack of motivation of writing, especially within English-only context in which the norm is English only, my students did feel less competent, disconnected, and constrained by these institutional norms. And so as a result, we said, okay, what can we do to maybe increase their autonomy, competence, and relatedness within this particular environment using translanguaging? And so these are my 3 research questions. Does the implementation of translanguaging practices in an academic writing course enhance my students, in this case, pre-service EFL teachers' perceived autonomy, competence, and relatedness? What changes occurred in their attitudes towards translanguaging? And what changes occur in their language attitudes towards English and Spanish in academic context? So the way we kind of constructed the study was at the beginning of the semester, they took 2 surveys. One was the attitudes towards translanguaging tool, which basically kind of rated some items on a Likert scale, and then attitudes towards languages, English and Spanish in this case, at the beginning and at the end of the semester. So it was like a pre and a post-test type of design. And then during the semester, we had some written reflections that were integrated throughout. In this way, they were able to kind of express their thoughts and ideas about how they were feeling about translanguaging as we were implementing this within the course itself. And so the primary kind of focus was it's a quantitative study with qualitative data embedded. So this is therefore embedded mixed methods. And so these are the things that we actually did with regards to translanguaging. First, because as you know, we had my students read research articles, which they were like, oh, yay, research articles. I can't wait to read this. But one of the reasons why was because they felt a little bit overwhelmed. And so I was able to teach them some reading strategies and having them annotate their reading articles using those strategies. But they were able to choose between Spanish or English. They were reading in English, but they were able to choose whether they wanted to annotate in English or Spanish. Then after they read, they discussed with their peer what they understood about their article, either in English or Spanish. Whenever they were writing about what they had read, they could get feedback on their writing in Spanish or English, and their final literature review was in English. So throughout the whole process, from the very beginning to the end, we incorporated these translanguaging strategies throughout our course. And it was a very much a normal part of our course. So it was from the very beginning of the semester that we had implemented this. And so the first question, in terms of autonomy, competence, and relatedness, what we, based on the written reflections, so this is purely based on the reflections itself, was that yes, actually translanguaging did show, according to their reflections, an increased sense of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And they gave reasons specifically. So first, when we think about autonomy, is that ability to choose, have that feeling of like, okay, I can choose what I want to do in this case and have agency. They said, because I was able to choose the language in which I was able to write my annotations, to give feedback, to talk about what I was learning, this freedom allowed me to have more autonomy in my learning process and in terms of my writing. With regards to competence, students, there were some interesting things going on here. They said, yes, I do feel like I'm better in writing in English, but it's because of a couple of things. One is that I'm able to clearly express my ideas because I've spoken to my peer about those ideas. And I consider it a tool to help me develop my English writing. One thing that was interesting, though, was that they were saying that when they were talking with their peer in Spanish, sometimes the vocabulary that they had read in English, they didn't know the word in Spanish. So they said, oh, yeah, I read this word in English, but I don't know what that word is in Spanish. And so there was kind of a little bit of interesting things going on with that. But one of the biggest findings, I would say, was that students felt a deeper sense of connection to the academic environment. They were able to have more clear feedback with their peers. They were able to feel comfortable to express what they had learned from the research articles, as well as to get feedback. And they also felt not judged by their peers, so that they were able to use translanguaging, whether in English or Spanish, to express those things. So they didn't say, oh, you're not speaking in English, how dare you? They didn't have that feeling because it was a normal part of our classroom environment. So ultimately, they felt they had more participation and better communication, being able to express their ideas in either language they chose. Ultimately, saying, I feel more motivated to write in my second language in terms of academically. So this is great for us. We were thankful to receive those findings, and we noticed that change over the period of the semester. And here are some of the quotes. I just want you to kind of see just some of the things that kind of stood out to us. They were able to go deeper into their topic, understand difficult reading, work more efficiently, communicating better. So all of these things were great results in terms of using translanguaging. So now, in terms of the quantitative materials, in terms of what we used, so as you remember, we used both a pre and post test design, one of which was our attitudes towards language tool, which was kind of some of the items you can see on the screen. How personally connected are you with English? How personally connected are you with in Spanish? Those are some of the items that were on that tool. And then the attitudes towards translanguaging. So for example, using both languages in class is an appropriate practice. So we wanted to see, okay, how much change happened from the beginning of the semester and then during as we used translanguaging and as a result of our translanguaging strategy that we implemented. And so, as you can see over time, our students' translanguaging attitudes became more positive over time, which was interesting change that we noticed. And specifically, these are the things that increased in terms of the survey that we implemented. Things like using both languages in class is an appropriate practice. That using both languages develops my confidence in English. So these specifically increased over time from the beginning of the semester until the end. And here are just some questions, some reflections about translanguaging. And I just want you to kind of look at the yellow pieces or the yellow things that I highlighted and write in the chat really quickly something that stood out to you in terms of what they said about translanguaging. I'll just give you a few minutes to look it over. What's something that stood out or stands out to you? And this was at the end of the semester. Our native language should be seen as a tool, not a barrier. Thank you, Dr. Rosa. Someone else, something that stood out. This would be the time that I pull out my prizes and start, if you were in person, I would say, okay, let's see who wants a piece of candy. And I would start throwing into the audience for those who participated. Sorry, I can't send anything virtually, but who else could say something that stood out to you? Okay, Spanish is beneficial. L1 use should not be prohibited, but used as a tool. Thank you, Brisa. Spanish beneficial when we're learning a second language. Thank you so much. I think it's Marlene. Thank you. Reinforcing a language, involving our background knowledge, right? So it's part of, and something that really always, the identity thing is really interesting for me, right? Where it says that our mother tongue is part of us, right? It's part of who we are. And so we need to make sure that we can tap into that background knowledge in terms of our students, because as we know, that's so important for them to understand anything. And so finally, the third question was, and this was actually the question that kind of blew my mind in terms of some of the results, because the question here was, what changes occur in terms of attitudes towards English and Spanish in academic contexts? So over time, we noticed that, in terms of attitudes, students had very positive attitudes to both English and Spanish. Although in general, Spanish, they had a more positive attitude towards Spanish. However, there was a decline in Spanish attitudes over time, which was interesting. It's something that was like, oh no, this is concerning for me because it doesn't fit into my little research box. So we're going to be kind of digging into what that looks like in a moment. So as you can see, over time, translanguaging attitudes became more positive. And there really wasn't a correlation between attitudes of languages and translanguaging. So at any time at all. So overall, there was not really a relationship between those. Okay, which kind of is shown here as well. But these are some things that differed at time 1 and time 2. So in terms of some things that were different between English and Spanish, that Spanish was always greater in terms of how difficult it is for you, which in this case it was easy, right? It's easier for me than English. What is your emotional feelings towards this? Spanish was always more, people felt more connected, more comfortable, more confident in part of their identity and who they are. But, of course, in English, because this is an English language teaching program, students always said, for you, my professional value in English is greater than Spanish. They said also the social perception of English is greater than Spanish, and it's relevant to my education. In this case, English. And so things that changed over time in terms of English and Spanish. So how confident in terms of English, what is your comfort level with using English in the classroom actually increased. So that's really great. So, this kind of disproves the idea that translanguaging is going to have a negative impact on your confidence in speaking in a language. And in Spanish, how confident are you in speaking Spanish? Of course, and that unfortunately that decreased. Motivation to use Spanish decreased, which I was like, no, my data's not fitting into my bubble. And then how prestigious is Spanish? Also decreased. So these things kind of made me think, okay, what's going on here? Why is this true? And so some things kind of made me question why is this happening? So I think here overall, if I had to kind of put my finger on it, why did my students feel less confident speaking Spanish, less motivated to use Spanish, and consider that Spanish is not as prestigious, even though we implemented a translanguaging classroom environment, which again, I couldn't understand. It made me kind of reflect with my research partners. And one thing that I can say, in this case, it highlights a necessity to do some transformation in terms of how I implement translanguaging. And so I invite you to kind of think along with me. So first of all, one of my thoughts initially when I saw this data that didn't fit into my box was that I needed to not simply allow Spanish in my classroom. I couldn't just say, okay guys, we're going to be translanguaging, so let's use it in this way. We also have to develop classrooms in which we critically discuss, how language ideologies, specifically with an academic context, how they influence our perception of prestige. So in this case, as we're using translanguaging, maybe my students were like, okay, we're using it, but we're using it for English. We're creating a final product, but that literature review is going to be in English. So really Spanish is not as prestigious as English in this space. So first, I, as a teacher, but in a researcher specifically, have to consider how to actively develop that critical language awareness so that they can examine why Spanish may not be perceived as prestigious in academic spaces, and how those beliefs, just like I was talking about how my beliefs were constructed by different contexts, how those beliefs are shaped by broader forces institutionally and on a social level. Second, another thought when I was thinking about this was that Spanish needs to be positioned as a resource for academic learning. So it's not just, okay, here's a task and you're going to use Spanish to help you do it in English, but here's a task in which you must use Spanish to analyze and argue and reflect, not just to support comprehension. And so when Spanish is used in a rigorous work, in rigorous ways, it becomes legitimatized as a language of knowledge. And so we want to make sure that those languages are part and valued in our academic communities. And at the same time, I think it's important to address those ideological tensions because they exist. And they exist whether you don't talk about them or not. They exist in our department, they amongst the professors, they exist amongst our students. And so we do have to address those tensions because as they begin to start embracing translanguaging, in which that's what we notice that our students do, that they might start questioning those ideological beliefs about keeping languages separate. And so we must make those tensions visible and talk about those tensions rather than ignoring them, okay? So that's kind of what I was taking away from some of this data. Additionally, translanguaging can't just happen in one course, right? Like I was thinking, okay, in my academic writing course, I'm going to be implementing this as part of my curriculum. But it has to be something that is across our curriculum. They need to have our students who are English language teachers or going to be in the future need to have consistent experiences that reinforce the value of their full linguistic resources and their identities as bilingual individuals who are pre-service English teachers. And then finally, this work requires a shared vision amongst our faculty. So without this alignment, again, my students are saying, I don't know how to use this. I get all these mixed messages from my professors. And that's something that as a department, not only within my university, but across our whole world, I would say, that we need to understand language not just as a pedagogical, translanguaging as a pedagogical tool, but also it helps us to consider how we understand it within the context of equity. And so really this concept of translanguaging is more than just a strategy, but it actually represents a broader pedagogical and ideological shift within our universities and within our field of English language teaching. So I want to end with a final reflection. Again, I want to ask if you wouldn't mind reading it for 1 second and just like writing a few words that stick out to you about what Carmen said. This is not her real name, this is not her real picture, but one of my students who I love so much. Just take a moment. What's something that stands out about what she says? What sticks out to you? Thank you, Dr. Rosa. Dr. Rosa, you get a star, gold star. Thank you. Absolutely, there's a connection. Decolonization and translanguaging, they're so connected. They're part of the same mission of equity. Someone else. I can feel you typing away. Let's have one more comment. Who else? Thank you, Brisa. Absolutely. Marginalization of the L1 when learning our L2 or L3, right? Thank you. So I will like to just invite you to, as I said, consider using, translanguaging or investigating, researching. Invite you to be a part of this conversation that ultimately leads to what is my heart of my research, which is equity. And I would also like to invite you to be part, if you would like to learn more about bilingualism within ELT or translanguaging. I'm always willing to collaborate with students, with other researchers, because ultimately the goal is the same. And so if you would like to reach out, this is my contact information. And, we definitely would like to, if you would like to form a band, I would like some more band members to be part of my research group. That's always something that's a willing thing that I would like to be participating in. Mentorship, advice, whatever you would like, please reach out. I'm more than happy to be part of this conversation. So thank you again. And if you have any questions, I will be more than happy to answer them.
Thanks, Doctora Muñoz. I have some comments and questions, but I'm going to give the turn to Marlene first. So Marlene, go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much, Brisa. First of all, congratulations on your research. Since I saw the title of your research on the seminar schedule, I was really excited. And the findings you presented are very interesting. I may have a bias because I strongly agree with the use of students' full linguistic repertoire in language learning. I am an English teacher, but I work more as a Spanish teacher to teach Spanish to foreign students. So I use their mother tongue to teach them, and they have improved their Spanish skills when they are learning Spanish. I know that this might be a question that often comes up when discussing translanguaging in EFL context, particularly in contexts where both teachers and students share the same mother tongue. I tried to do a research regarding to translanguaging, but every time that I was trying to achieve or to show them this idea that students can use the R1 to learn, in this case, English, a common question came really frequently. So in this case, how do we distinguish translanguaging from strategic L1 use or code switching in the classroom, or grammar translation in the case of academic writing?
Well, I think in general, every classroom environment is going to look very differently, right? You're not going to, if you go into one classroom that uses translanguaging, it's going to look different from another classroom that uses that same or creates that space as a translanguaging space. So I think the term, I stay away from code switching, the term code switching, because again, it represents a specific language theory. And so my understanding, because of the research that's been done on bilingual people, looking at it as an integrated language system, I exclusively use the term translanguaging now. Sometimes I mess up and say L1, L2, but even that, those terms are really more, those are more like associated with that mentality of like those separated systems, right? And so I'm sorry, I forgot your question, Marlene. I'm sorry.
It's okay. Don't worry. It's because this question, um, I mean, it's always common. Like, what is the difference between, or how do you distinguish between translanguaging and code switching? Because it's very, I understand. I mean, I read Garcia and I read Lee, and I understand that they are talking about translanguaging because they live in, for example, United States, and they have these groups where students have different languages. Their mother tongue is not the same, and they are able to use their linguistic repertoire. But in the case of the EFL context, like you mentioned that you are a teacher in Mexico and you teach English to Mexican students, and you share, but because you share with us that you know Spanish, so they share the same language, right? You and the students are sharing Spanish. So how do we distinguish translanguaging from strategic L1 use or code switching in the classroom?
So I will say, first of all, that no matter what language you have as a teacher, you can still implement translanguaging in your classroom. You can be a monolingual English teacher, which many of my colleagues in the US are, who still have translanguaging spaces. And they allow their students, and they specifically allow their students to use their first language in to understand the English tasks. However, as a bilingual person, and I'm very thankful to understand and know Spanish, I'm able to make those explicit connections with my students. And that's the power that a bilingual teacher has over a monolingual teacher. I'm able to share, oh, look, do you notice that this word and this word are the same? Oh, do you notice that this grammatical structure and this is similar or different? Pointing out those differences within their writing. And so, as I mentioned, I think the idea of code switching isn't something that is more of the way you view languages and how bilingual people learn it. But in terms of where you are in the world, whether you're in the US, whether you're in Mexico, whether you share the same language as your students or not, translanguaging can occur in all of those scenarios in different ways. But there's a power in being a bilingual teacher, knowing the first language of your students, because you're able to make those explicit connections. And even though my students mainly speak to me in English, because that's the language that I mainly speak with them, I'm able to say, oh, did you notice that in your writing, you're doing this, this, and this? And oh, this is very similar to what it's like in Spanish. That's why you're seeing this. But in English, this is what we do. So I'm able to make that very clear to them, so they're able to make those connections, if that makes sense.
Yes, it makes sense. Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Marlene. Now, Doctora Rosa, she's your very big fan, so she has a question for you.
I'm her big fan because she keeps participating. Thank you so much.
Thank you. No, yes, I'm a fan now. You have a new fan now.
Aw, be part of my band. I'm looking for band
Sure,
members.
sure, I will. I'm actually supervising an undergraduate thesis, and it is about translanguaging. I see my student is connected here too. But my question is related to the investigation of my student because he is, I mean, we're having troubles on how to evaluate the process he followed because it's an action research. So we follow the, well, 5 steps. He diagnosed, he designed a proposal with translanguaging strategies, and then he intervened, and now it's time to evaluate. So I'm like, I was looking at the way you evaluate the attitudes and the changes in the students' beliefs. So I found it very interesting. So I don't know if we can contact you to
Yes,
talk a little bit more about it. And
absolutely.
and can I say something about the difference between code switching and translanguaging as I understand it?
Sure, yeah, please.
It's like, I think that code switching is like a natural process, like it's part of being bilingual or trilingual. But the translanguaging is more like a deliberated process. You are aware and you want your students to be conscious on that they can use the whole linguistic repertoire. It's the way I understand it.
So in the case of the researchers that I shared with you, and I didn't emphasize this enough. I think probably that was my problem with the confusion about the two. When you're looking at the idea of spontaneous translanguaging, which again is something that you mentioned was a natural process for bilingual students or bilingual individuals. That's something that happens whether or not you know it's happening or not, right? It's part of your brain. It's how your brain is reacting to a specific task. When it comes to instruction, when we're talking about pedagogical translanguaging. Now we're being intentional about accessing and connecting to our students' linguistic resources in specific tasks and in specific ways. So really the spontaneous part, it really just something that happens. The pedagogical translanguaging is something that's intentional by the teacher. And one of the things that I wanted to share with regards to the quote that we saw at the very end with my student Carmen was that she was noticing that she started to apply the same ideas in other classes. So not only was she doing it in the academic writing class, but she said, oh, now I can read things in Spanish for my methodology class and for this class and that class. And that's my way of going deeper into the topic, which of course is the dream of every teacher, is to apply what you're teaching them into other classes. And so she was able to see the power of pedagogical translanguaging in her other subjects, which ultimately helped her to be able to understand those subjects better. So really that's the distinction between spontaneous translanguaging and pedagogical translanguaging.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Doctora Rosa. Now we have the participation from Dr. Isaac. He has a question for you.
Yes, Dr. Muñoz, thank you so much for your insights. I have 2 questions I'd like to ask you. The first, the research or the data you presented, it gives a small glimpse of this tendency of using translanguaging as a tool to further develop competency, in this case, the target language English. And we can think of many different reasons why, be it imperialism, colonization, globalization, etc. How do you confront this this challenge, this perspective in your research?
Isaac, first of all, thank you. That was a great question. And thank you for participating, Isaac. I want to say, for me, as a, it's kind of interesting because actually I didn't realize that it would be such a controversial thing. And obviously, knowing my background, which is the context of the US, and having those, becoming an advocate for students' first language and knowing and being aware of the forces, the systemic oppression that exists within the US context about not valuing Spanish. For me, from the very beginning, when I started my research, I have had a critical lens with regards to my research, with regards to identity formation, about how, initially my research was with bilingual teachers in the US, how they themselves didn't really have a bilingual education themselves because our bilingual education really only goes up to 5th grade in the US. And then after 5th grade, students who are in bilingual programs are then mainstreamed into English only classrooms. And so we have bilingual teachers who are currently bilingual teachers in the US who might only have had a 5th grade education in terms of the development of their Spanish language. And now they themselves are teachers trying to develop their students' 5th grade, academic language. So anyway, this critical paradigm has always been a part of my research, along with my partner, my research other band member. And now that I'm here in Mexico, it is continuing because as you guys know, because you're familiar with the context, there's those same forces of systemic oppression exist in Mexico, exist within our ELT programs, and even within my own colleagues who I love dearly, they are themselves Mexican professors, English teachers. They are like, no, English only, because that's just the way they have been. The context has basically developed that language ideology. And so, as I mentioned before, this is my first attempt to kind of disrupt those ideologies by allowing my students to experience translanguaging themselves, because I didn't want to preach at them. I wanted them to experience that thing themselves. A lot of them, when they came into my class, they said, oh, this is just for beginners, right? Just for beginner English learners. But absolutely not. They were wrestling with English text, struggling, and they were like, ooh, I need a tool to help me. Oh, I know, I can use Spanish to help me understand this, right? So even advanced learners, such as my students, were able to see the value of translanguaging. And so ultimately, this is the beginning of something that I hope to contribute with both a pragmatic as well as a critical lens in terms of the research.
Yes, thank you so much. And if I may follow up, you mentioned on identity. And I'd like to ask, have you considered doing any work on identity? And I ask this because I myself did a BA in English language teaching. I was a pre-service English teacher. And without us knowing, this was a few years ago before translanguaging was where it is now. And without us even knowing, it was our sort of our way of going about our modus operandi, if we can say. And it was very common for us to behave and act in that way. And it was like, hey, I just discovered this new taco place. Y cuestan solo 15 pesos. Let's go. Do you guys want to go? And it became part of our identity. It was this nostalgia. It was this sort of pride, this sense of pride that we could develop in saying, hey, there's more like us, and we can use this to represent ourselves.
Absolutely. I think you cannot separate language from identity. It's part of something that, as I mentioned in my previous research, when I was working with U.S. bilingual teachers, identity is part of the conversation when it comes to language. Here specifically, and again, this study was not an identity study at all. It was just strictly looking at how translanguaging could increase their sense of autonomy, competency, and relatedness. But I had students talk about identity in their reflections. They were saying, oh, this doesn't make me less Mexican, to be able to, I was like, what? Do you feel less Mexican? Do you feel, how do you feel? What is your linguistic identity? And so I've had some really interesting conversations with students talking about how as English pre-service teachers, they feel different from maybe their friends, other BAs, other, individuals from the undergraduate program. And because their first language is not valued, it does impact how they feel about that. And so it is something that is interesting to me and something that I hope to explore in the future. Absolutely.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Isaac. And well, finally, Dr. Muñoz, I want to tell you that I feel very identified with your research because my research for my master program is about implementation of the English only policy in a bilingual school here in Mexico, where we have schools that have their own definition of what is bilingual. And it is like an adaptation of the bilingual systems that we have in the United States. But at the same time, we have the implementation of an English-only policy or an English-only norm in classrooms. So my study is looking for teachers' perspectives regarding the implementation of that policy in this context. So I will be like very happy to be in your band. And for me, it will be like very important to have you, if you have the time to attend tomorrow. I'm going to be presenting my study, and I think that listening to your feedback will be something very important. And if you don't have the time, I will send you an email, and I want you to read my job. And if you can give me some comments, some recommendations, it will be very important for me. And also, all that you mentioned was really interesting. And as we are students from the master's program, I would like to, well, in name of my classmates, I would like to invite you to our podcast. We as students from the master program, we have a podcast, and it will be great to have you in one of our episodes. So we are going to be in contact via email. And well, just congratulations on your work.
Well, I want to say, Brisa, just really quickly, I want to say I also saw the topic that on the schedule, and I was like, ooh, I hope Brisa is going to be, part of the conversation. So I would be honored to read your work. And I think I don't speak for every researcher, but I do speak for those who are researchers and teachers at heart, that anything I can do to help your research, and specifically in the name of equity and translanguaging, I am absolutely down to do that. So please feel free to contact me. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much. We didn't have like a lot of time because, well, I am the masters of ceremony. So I have to give the word to my colleagues, but I'm going to be in contact with you, and well, it will be an honor to be working with you and receive your feedback.
Oh,
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Kimberly is becoming a prominent rock star in the field. So it was an honor to have her here in the seminar. Thank you very much for this such great presentation, and also for being in contact with the program, and also being willing to help and also contribute to projects and activities. Thank you very much, Kim. And before we conclude today's first session, can I ask you to open your cameras? So we have a picture together, and that's going to be the end of today's first session of the seminar. Ya veo a mi amiguísima Araceli Valenzuela de Oaxaca. Muchas gracias, Sara, por estar. Ale, Carla, Brisa, Marlene, se la rifaron. Isaac, Naye, gracias de verdad por apoyar. Mónica, Ricardo, doctora Rosa, gracias por estar muy participativa el día de hoy. Y pues bueno, ¿ya estamos listos? La voy a contar a la de 3 y todos sonriendo, ¿sale? 1, 2, 3. Una más, perdón. Para presumirlos en redes. Listo, pues muchísimas gracias y nos vemos el día de mañana un poquito antes de las 9 de la mañana para empezar con la última keynote presentation. Pasen bonita noche.
Gracias.
Okay. Thank you so much for your presence and participation.
Gracias, buenas noches.
Buenas noches.